clinical experience working with people to promote lifestyle change. She is the Director of Behavioral Health Services for St. Luke's Humphreys Diabetes Center and a clinical consultant with St. Luke's Children's Integrative Medicine and Pediatric Pain Programs. Dr. Walters earned both of her master's degree and her PhD from Utah State University, and she is a board member of the Idaho Psychological Association, serves as Idaho's Public Education Coordinator to the American Psychological Association, and is the Psychological Director for Idaho Diabetes Youth Programs. So welcome, Amy. We are so happy to have you here to talk about how to prepare ourselves for psychologically for long-term success. So I'm going to let you go ahead and take the presentation away. So go for it, Amy.
And thanks everyone for joining me. I know these are unusual times, creating a lot of additional demands for people, so appreciate you joining us. We have our call today for about 30 minutes, so I'll spend about the next 20 minutes presenting, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. Please feel free to text in any questions that you have so that we can address those as the presentation moves along.
Give me a second.
So I'm going to cover some basic elements today about how to make and sustain change when it comes to weight management. Key areas that we'll be discussing are setting goals, keeping your commitment and your readiness for change, focusing on health habits, maintaining motivation, understanding some of your triggers for falling into old behavior patterns, and then some behavioral strategies that we Whenever we talk about behavior change, I like to reference some research that was done back in the 80s by Prochaska and DiClemente that has to do with how people make change. And I think this is actually becoming some familiar in pop psychology now. Most people have heard of stages of change from one presentation or another, but I think it's helpful when we talk about weight loss and weight management. One of the things we know is that change is a process that doesn't start with action. It actually starts with pre-contemplation, where it's not even on our radar. Then we move into a phase where we start thinking about change, what that might look like, what that would mean for us, how important it is to us. And once we've thought about it for a while, we actually start planning that change, how we're going to do it, what it's going to take, what that looks like. And then we move to action. And so if you've been on a weight loss journey, you have been in a phase of action where you have changed some of your behaviors or some of your routines or your environment to support this goal that you've set for yourself. And now comes the most important part of the change process, which is maintenance or relapse. So maintaining change is something that takes energy, that takes planning, that takes focus. And it can be a challenge. We know that a large portion of people who lose weight gain it back and then some. So if we're not successful in maintaining that change that we've made, we fall into a pattern of relapse. And this is fairly common. And that's what we want to prevent. Typical progression for health behavior change is not what we expect. When we set out to make a change, we start kind of at the base of that straight line and we think we're going to just make this nice upward progress moving forward with each step. What we actually see is quite different than that. We see people start off strong, they're excited, they're motivated, especially once they start seeing results, and then something happens like the COVID-19 outbreak and people fall off the wagon. They're home, there's snacks available, they're bored, and they start slipping back into old patterns. What we know is that the behaviors that helped us get there in the first place, to start that initial ascent, can actually help us again. And so we want to be able to pick ourselves up from this place of struggle and implement those same strategies that helped us get there. And over time, we want to spend more time in this state of change and less time falling into these old habits. But that comes with practice and planning. And goal setting can be an important part of that. We know from research that when people set goals, especially when they follow a SMART goal format, it really helps them to be more successful. One thing we talk a lot about in psychology is starting small and focusing on one behavior at a time. It's easy to get excited and try to make multiple changes at once, but people tend to be less successful in doing that. So focusing on one small thing. This week, I'm going to work on reducing my sugar sweetened beverages, is an example. We want to be realistic about it and set goals in achievable steps. So if I'm someone who currently drinks a 2 liter of Coke each day, it may not be realistic for me to go cold turkey right off the bat. I may need to break that down and shift to maybe a half that amount and then shift it down half again. And then I can get to a place of not having any. But taking those small steps can help you be successful and maintain motivation. If we set goals that are too high for our skill base, that can often zap our motivation. We want to have a quantifiable definition. So being very specific with yourself. If you're going to be working on exercise, being specific, stating, I'm going to go for a walk 30 minutes after work in my neighborhood, and I'm going to do that every day. That's very easy to write that out and have it be quantified so that we can see how we're doing in our accountability with maintaining our goal. It's important to reward yourself for those small successes. We can do that by calling out our successes. We can do that by giving ourselves a penny in a jar each time we achieve a success, and then later having that as some kind of a reward of our choice. Maybe that's getting a massage or getting to go on a fun outing or something else that we would enjoy. Finding a buddy can be helpful in keeping that motivation going and keeping us accountable. So I encourage you to bring in somebody else as you're working towards maintaining that positive change that you've made with lifestyle. And then forgiving yourself for mistakes, knowing that we are going to have those periods where we get off track, where we fall into old behaviors, that's just human nature, and that we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I like to use the example of toothbrushing here. Most people make a habit of brushing their teeth before they go to bed each night. But every so often we fall asleep on the couch and forget to brush our teeth. You don't typically wake up the next day and say, that's it, I'm done, I'm never brushing my teeth again, I've failed. And yet we do that with dietary habits all the time. We get off track and we think the day's ruined. And so not only do we drive through McDonald's at lunch, but then we go home and have pizza and cookies and treats and figure, we've blown it, so we might as well just go for it. So if you do fall off track, just remind yourself of the strategies that helped you in the first place and get back on. Just brush those teeth the minute you think of it. Some of the basic keys to success in maintaining weight loss are really focusing on those basic health habits, making sure that really we're attending to our dietary choices, making sure that we are following a healthy meal plan with lots of great fruits and vegetables, high fiber, and lean meats. If you choose to follow an animal-based diet, if you're doing only plant-based, then making choices that align with that. Exercise. We know that exercise is a very important part of weight loss and weight management, and keeping our goals up there, staying engaged, continuing to progress in our exercise routine. We know that sleep is very important for overall health and weight management. So if you struggle with your sleep, getting assistance in that area, learning about good sleep hygiene and following those routines, or talking to your provider if you're having issues with sleep about a possible sleep study or diagnosis of what may be happening. Stress is a good one that behavioral health professionals love to talk about. We know that stress absolutely has an impact on overall health, and it definitely has an effect on our weight. When we are under high levels of stress, our body releases a hormone called cortisol, and that cortisol can definitely play a role in weight management. It likes us to hold on to any extra fuel that we have for later in case we need it. So keeping our stress under good control is going to be an important part of maintaining our weight loss. And then the final area has to do with behavior modification for habits. We have years and years and years of research that tells us more about how people behave, what our natural tendencies are, and we can use that to our advantage when we're working on maintaining good health habits. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So sustaining motivation can come from internal sources. It can also come from external sources. So when we talk about internal motivation, those are motivators that come from within. Being able to recognize and follow our core values. So for example, if health is important to us, remembering that and connecting our behavioral choices with those values. We can be motivated by feelings of pride or achievement when we've been working hard to engage in healthy behaviors and having some successes that way. And really working hard to prevent disease or improve current disease state. For some people, internal motivation is not enough, and that's okay. Or sometimes when we first start out, internal motivation can be difficult. So in those cases, it's fine to turn to external motivators. So these are things like money, rewards, attention from other people, additional privileges. In the past, I've done work with patients around use of external rewards for weight loss, and many people do find this helpful. So for example, when you go to the grocery store and you're tempted to put that bag of cookies in your grocery cart or in your virtual grocery cart during our COVID-19 pandemic, instead of doing that, just writing down the dollar amount that you were going to spend on those cookies and then giving yourself that money in cash or in a rewards jar later can be a great way to use an external motivator. You then end up with a pretty large sum pretty quickly from all the poor choices you were going to make, and instead you can use that money to go towards some other kind of positive self-care, like vacation, massage, or something else, lunch with a friend, something of your choosing. If you are using external motivators, we know that novelty and change are important. We tend to stagnate when we're using the same reinforcer over and over and over again. So changing that up, having different ways to keep things interesting can kind of help keep motivation going. That also applies with food and physical activity. So we know that novelty is something that keeps us interested and engaged. If we're doing the very same thing for lunch day in and day out, that can get old and we can tend to want to slide out of our healthy habits. So trying new recipes, trying different exercises, keeping things moving and changing can really help you stay engaged. The environment is an area that I feel is often overlooked, but is incredibly important when it comes to setting us up for success. We really live in what many have called an obesogenic culture, which is a culture that promotes obesity. Number one, we have a fairly sedentary lifestyle. 2 out of 3 Americans don't get the recommended amount of physical activity that we need to. And some of this has to do with just some of our modern advances when it comes to work and play. When we think about work decades ago, it was much more physical in nature. Nowadays, many people work in offices, sit in cubicles, sit behind a desk. We have remote controls that do a lot of things. When I think back to my old childhood days, watching TV, we only had a few channels, and if you wanted to watch something different, you had to get up and change the channel and then sit back down. Now we have remote control that can do a lot of things. We have chairs that have refrigerators in them, so we don't even have to get up and get a drink out of the refrigerator. We have food that is available, prepared and ready to go through drive-thrus or other kinds of convenience foods. So we've taken a lot of the energy use out of our daily practices. That means we don't need as much energy from food as we once did. And yet we have food science going on, which has engineered products that are very tasty and irresistible. We have this triad of the fat, sugar, salt combination, which really activates the pleasure centers in our brain and drives that desire to have more and more of those foods, even though they're not very healthy options. If you question this, just look around your environment. We've got all kinds of fast food readily available to most of us on our drives home. We have all kinds of visual triggers in our environment reminding us how to have these things and why to have these things. And then many of them are offered at very low prices, which make them both convenient and tempting. And so we throw that together with our food science, and it makes it difficult to avoid. So we want to set up your own environment for success. And think about making that healthy choice the easy choice. Getting the junk food out of your house, driving home in a way that doesn't go by your favorite fast food restaurant. These are all ways that we can use that environment to really promote the healthy choices that we're working on sustaining. If you do fall back into old patterns, learning your triggers can be an effective strategy to avoid and prevent that in the future. So I talk about the ABCEs of behavior change, and this stands for affect, behavior, cognition, and environment. And so I encourage you, if you find yourself slipping off track with your healthy eating or exercise, try to recognize what are the triggers for you. So I'll give you an example. I grew up in a family where we did a lot of road trips, and part of our road trips always included snacks. So I have had this learned association with eating in my car. And one of the things that you can do or kind of track if you are having a hard time, what's the environment that's happening in? Where are you? What's the behavior that you're engaged in? How are you feeling emotionally? And what are some of the thoughts that are going through your head during that time? So with my example, I may be driving in my car, I'm feeling kind of bored or restless, and the thought that comes to my mind is, oh, a snack is going to help me pass the time or give me some extra energy, give me something interesting to do. So by starting to recognize what some of those triggers are for us, it can really help us in a preventive way to shift those patterns. We can use what psychologists call functional assessment to determine some of those patterns. I do want to remind everybody that change is hard, and we're actually kind of hardwired by our instinct to repeat some of those old patterns. So when you're trying to make behavior change, you're really swimming upstream, and it's going to take some additional energy and some additional thought and planning to do that successfully. When you are running into barriers, try to really gather some data and explore and problem solve all those in a non-judgmental way. Remembering that behavior change is hard and that our autopilot response is going to be to fall into those old patterns. Try to understand the basic nature of the behavior and what's driving it. And we can do that by analyzing those ABCE elements that I spoke of. This is a visual that I like to call the behavior pyramid that can be a nice way to help you understand your behaviors. So we can go through any of our health behaviors and identify these different elements. So the A stands for affect. How are we feeling in this moment and what's driving that for us? The behavior is the doing part. What is it that we're engaging in this moment? The cognition is what are the thoughts, and the environment is the situation that it's happening in. An example of this might be perhaps I have fallen into a behavior pattern of walking in the door, sitting on my couch, turning on Netflix, and binge watching my favorite show for the hours after I get off work. Some of the affective factors that may be sustaining that are feeling tired and exhausted and just wanting to disconnect. Maybe cognitively I'm thinking, wow, I've had a hard day at work with all of this going on and I really just deserve to relax. Environmentally, my couch is there, my snacks are next to me, and my behavior is I'm just vegging out on the couch. By identifying those elements, I can start to understand what's driving my behavior and how I want to change that to better support health habits. There are some basic rules of health behavior. One, as I've mentioned, is that behavior is habitual and the past tends to be the best predictor of the future. So being really mindful, making conscious choices to engage in behaviors that support our health goals is going to be helpful. We know that behavior is learned, and it can be learned through associations with conditioned responses, much like my example of getting in my car and suddenly feeling like I had a need to have a snack. It can be learned through reinforcement and punishment, where something positive happens, so we do it more often, or there's a negative consequence, and so we tend to avoid it. And it can also occur through modeling. Modeling is important because having good, helpful models who engage in good health behaviors will keep us engaged in that kind of behavior as well. And then behavior tends to be goal directed. So asking ourselves, what need is this serving? And is there a healthier way for me to engage in a behavior that would meet that same need, but in a healthier way? Sorry, my deck advanced one too many. So quick review of some of the things that we've talked about for weight management. Number one, you have to maintain those basic behaviors for success. Avoiding the sugary drinks, staying away from the fast food, making sure you're getting enough sleep, moving regularly, and coping with stress are probably the top 5. So check yourself if you start to slide into old patterns. How am I doing with each one of these areas, and can I get back on track with healthy choices? Really developing alternative coping skills. Many of the people that I work with struggle with emotional eating and use food as a way to cope with stress, sadness, boredom, or even as a way to celebrate happy events. So recognizing that and learning some healthy alternative ways to cope will help set you up for the road for success. Keeping a food log is a great skill. We've got all kinds of fantastic apps that can help us this, or you can use old-fashioned pencil and paper, but this is an evidence-based strategy which has been shown to help people in maintaining weight loss. We can do a more advanced food log by adding in components about thoughts, feelings, and environment to help us identify triggers that may be triggering those old behavior patterns and getting us into trouble. We always want to be mindful of our stress levels and work on healthy stress management skills like relaxation, meditation, yoga, deep breathing, time with friends, exercise. Especially during our current climate, stress management is really important for overall health. We want to continue to set goals, especially around movement. Ideally, we want to be moving daily and getting at least 150 minutes per week if we are going to maintain our weight loss. Practicing good sleep hygiene, as I mentioned, is an important foundational skill. And if you're having sleep issues, make sure to get that diagnosed and treated, working with your primary care provider. Then finally, using functional assessment as a way to understand your behavior patterns, identifying those A, B, C, E elements can help you recognize and problem solve triggers and figure out ways to stay on track. Finally, I would just say expect a bumpy road and plan ahead. We know that the research shows us the vast majority of people who lose weight will gain some back, and we can prevent that by planning ahead, by being vigilant, by keeping our food and exercise logs, and staying on track and in line with our values for good health. So I want to open it up to questions.
Hey, Amy, this is Lisa.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, in the current climate, we have individuals that are in the weight loss challenge and, that started with some big goals. Can you speak to adjusting goals at, maybe they had a goal of losing 20 pounds in a year, and maybe with what we're experiencing, maybe it's time to readjust and kind of revisit some of that. So, and giving ourselves permission to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a lot of research lately on the element of psychological flexibility and its importance in overall health. we need to be able to adapt and adjust based on what's happening in our environment. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we are all faced with a set of circumstances that we haven't dealt with before. You know, maybe you were into a really good routine, going to the gym regularly after work, and now the gym is closed. Or you don't have the access to fresh fruits and vegetables that you once did because you're staying out of the stores. All of these things are very real barriers, and they can absolutely be things that we can work around. But being kind to yourself is important. Being able to adjust those goals. You know, maybe you set a new goal to, I'm just going to have some kind of movement each day. So I can't get to the gym, but I can walk around the block, or I can do exercises in my house, or I can tune into the YMCA on YouTube and learn some kind of a new virtual routine. So definitely it's important to kind of adjust based on the current situation, and always practicing that good self-compassion.
Awesome. Thanks.
Any other questions anyone has? You can either unmute yourself or you can type it into the text box. Thank you very much. So I guess if I'm here at St. Luke's, if anyone has additional questions, you can certainly shoot me a quick email. I just want to really encourage all of you to continue on your quest for good health. It's a lifelong process. Don't get discouraged by the current climate. Things will change, and practice your good psychological flexibility.
Yes. Thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate your time today. And if anyone has any questions they think of later on, feel free to email us at the Weight Loss Challenge at slhs.org, and we'd be happy to reach back out to Amy to see if we can get they answered for you.
Absolutely. Stay well, everyone.
Yeah. Stay healthy. Thanks, everyone.